What is a realist? Well, you will hear many answers depending on if you're asking one or if you're asking their opponents or enemies, you might say. Um, Here I will start off by elucidating to you what I perceive to be a realist from someone who is quite sympathetic. I believe that a realist is not, or claims not, to be informed by their own ideals when interpreting reality. In other words, not ideal, but reality. So the realist is is interpreting what they believe to be reality, regardless of what the normative claims are associated to such morality. Meaning normative, meaning it ought to be this way. We should have this. How could the world come to this? As somebody might say. A realist will assess situations based off either what they think truly happened, so if it's a historical realist view, or if they're looking at policy options, a realist will analyze what they think is possible in order to achieve said result. And this is at the basis of what I think realism is. And I think I just touched on the first misconception about realism. You can be a realist and have political ideals. You can want things to change. You can want to build a better society as a realist, in my opinion. But in doing so, you have to do, well, a few things. First of all, you have to be able to acknowledge constraints. So, in picturing your ideal society, a realist might come at it through a standpoint of what they believe to be a in reality view of human nature. Many realists believe that human beings have inherent tendencies towards violence, inherent tendencies towards lust, and passionate fits of rage. Many realists would not believe in this sort of noble savage character that many left-wing intellectuals have discussed primitive peoples through their own lens. They would disregard that and say, no, human beings actually have more violent, more power seeking tendencies. Realists would look at the Marxian argument of a post-classless, a post-scarcity state and laugh at it, because even if we could achieve such a world, realists might still believe that human beings would disrupt the society just based on social power relations between the leadership. So even if there was no scarcity, even if we all had the abundant means and there were no more monetary-based classes, then we would still find ways in order to achieve power and status in society. Realists in this way do not, as again quoting my professor again, they acknowledge that nobody has a monopoly on evil. And so I think that that misconception about what realism is, that it's just a strict descriptive lens of the world. And you're only analyzing things in these brute hard facts. I think that's wrong. I think realists can be moral and want to raise up, standards and culture and society, but they do it in the grounding of what they believe to be the physical constraints of this universe, of this spiritual world, of their general surroundings. And what's interesting about realism is that it transcends basically all facets of life, regardless of politics. You might have debates on your camping trip with your friends, where one person thinks, oh, like I'd love to stop here for an hour and a half and just look at the lake, but we probably should get there, because if we don't get there in time, like maybe the person won't be there to let us in. So a realist in that sense is acknowledging restraints whereas other people might uh, look towards the possibilities. Might instead of this is a big difference between realism and idealism is that an idealist personality, and I'll say personality or archetype, and I'll get to that in a bit. The idealist archetype is always it would start in their mental schema will start by looking at all the possibilities and searching for ones that make them feel the best inside, either for individual reasons or for reasons for higher ambitions. So idealists are looking for the possibilities, whereas realists tend to start by piecing together what they believe the constraints of the universe to be, constraints of the world to be, and then after they've built that puzzle, then they can assess how we can improve things. Realists often get critiqued for being so arrogant as to think that they know what reality is. So idealists will say, well, who are you to say human nature is this way? Who are you to say this is a real constraint on me? Speak for yourself. You get a lot of people saying that, and I have said that to some realists because I think that some people who have this picture in their mind of what the constraints are, often can misinterpret things. And so realism versus idealism comes up, all across, social relations and especially in our politics. And I think I mentioned this today just because I had a very telling and symbolic conversation with both my mother and father tonight. And I think that in assessing the archetypes of the feminine and the masculine, and this is not me saying that there's one masculine and one feminine. I think there are many masculine archetypes and many feminine archetypes. But generally speaking, I think that there is a certain masculine archetype that it's funny because it could go both ways actually, but there is a masculine archetype that understands the brutality of the world around them. They've been faced with harsh challenges. They've had to go out and make a life for themselves. There's a masculine archetype that is willing to do really drastic things and perform extremely harsh measures in order to achieve a political goal because they think that it's the only way to get it done. And so again, an idealist would not want to get to an end if the means were bad. So in saying if it takes an atrocity to achieve a certain goal, then an idealist might think rather badly about that because, it goes against their ideals. Whereas a realist understands how harsh and brutal the constraints of the world are, and therefore are much more willing to sacrifice that and commit these and have these bad things happen as a result, but also with the view of the greater good in mind. I think that is a really masculine archetype to be able to understand that suffering exists, but go full forth in confronting the suffering in order to get to a point beyond it. Whereas I think the feminine oftentimes has empathy and wants to protect against any possibility of the catastrophe happening in the first place. So therefore they put barriers up in order to, even go ahead with the means. And so I was talking to my father today, who is you could call a realist. And my mother was right beside, and we were talking about the issue of homelessness and drug addiction and the combination thereof in our society, which is a catastrophe. And my mom, who identifies in this particular context with the progressive school that believes in having a safe supply of drugs where people that are struggling can access them and not risk contamination within the drug supply. My mom thinks that in combination with social workers and public funding can solve the issue without, infringing upon the rights of the individual. Whereas my father is much more straight shooting, you could say, about the issue. He thinks that this cannot be solved without getting to the root of the problem, and he thinks that keeping people dependent on drugs is not getting to the root of the problem. And so him, like myself, propose a policy, and again, this might sound drastic in our liberal, postmodern, post-abolishment of capital punishment type worldview. And I'm not advocating capital punishment in the case of the of the drug users. Hear me out here. The policy that we're proposing here is one of identifying people in municipalities and cities that are clearly too out of touch to deal with their problems, are clearly completely dependent on drugs, cannot form proper sentences, cannot pull themselves out of this condition, and are a danger to people and a nuisance in general culture and society. And so the proposal is to identify these people and have authorities forcibly remove them and bring them to an encampment and facility. The proposal that we were talking about was in more northern Ontario, maybe a couple hours north of Toronto. Set up a facility that focuses on rehabilitation, takes them away from the drugs completely, which will create hard times for them. There will be struggle, and this will be non-voluntary. They won't be able to leave until a certain point. Obviously, the details of this policy would need to be fleshed out. Likely, you wouldn't want to press it past just a matter of months before you let them out. And you wouldn't be able to guarantee if they were, if they had rehabilitated themselves, if they were past their addiction. But the point of all this is that in the mind of the realist, this policy of forcibly bringing people that are struggling in this way to a facility to, non-voluntarily help them with their addiction, the perceived injustice of infringing on the individual's rights in this case does not trump the solution and the potential benefits that entails. In other words, if we can achieve the goal of decreasing homelessness, decreasing drug addiction, cleaning up the streets, uplifting the moral character of society, if we can achieve that goal, then harsh measures such as that not only are permissible, but they're actually inevitable and necessary. Because in the mind of the realist, the world is not a nice place. The world is not a place for where individuals can feel fulfillment and freedom at all times. This is a state of nature, to put it in political philosophy terms of political philosophy. And I think that divide between my mom and dad, and my mom was quite appalled to hear this opinion coming from both her husband and her son. That divide between the masculine of being willing to push through atrocities and the feminine of wanting to protect against suffering, especially among the vulnerable. That tension is very strong within the idealist and the realist. I think, it's not a contradiction, but I think there's also a masculine archetype of idealism as well. There's a masculine archetype of, exploring all different facets of life and trying to find the answers. And I think that's often the case in young men, who often don't are kind of confused in their life. But you'll find that a lot of older men, especially in positions of authority, who have lived in the world and had some form of power in their life and have had to show leadership, you find a lot of those men often have this realist attitude towards things. Um, Not completely that the ends justify the means, because that's not always the case. The realist can decide that the means are the means are too immoral, because again, the realist has moral values, but they simply acknowledge that harm will be done either way. The idealist does not the idealist does not acknowledge, usually, that the world is a cutthroat place, um, that no matter how hard we try, suffering is inevitable. The idealist lives in a world where humans can be devoid of hard times, in a sense. And it made me think of that cycle of hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. And I think if you lose that realist realist attitude in your society, I think you can often create hard times for your populace and your people, your demos, because things are difficult out here. And if you don't face that, if you choose to not believe that hard choices do not need to be made, with potential consequences either way, then you might have those consequences showing up on your doorstep, and maybe a needle in your arm.